June 5, 1944. A cold, mist-laden night blanketed the fields of southern England. Moonlight struggled through thick clouds, reflecting off the puddles in the sodden grass as the massive silhouettes of C-47 sky trains lumbered across the tarmac. Engines hummed with the restrained fury of a coiled spring, the air vibrating with tension and the scent of aviation fuel. Somewhere near the edge of the field, a single wind vane spun lazily, indifferent to the chaos around it. Inside one of the lumbering transports, Colonel Mike Kerr of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands were steady, but his jaw tightened as he surveyed the row of gliders lined up behind the planes. The CG-4 Waco gliders, fragile as paper yet loaded with jeeps, howitzers, and 13 men each, gleamed faintly under the dim floodlights. Soldiers whispered last-minute prayers, adjusted straps, and gripped their rifles as if sheer will could steel them against what lay ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, veteran of countless night maneuvers, leaned over the cockpit instruments of his C-47. His eyes flicked to the fuel gauge, then to the straps securing the glider. "Hold her steady," he muttered to his co-pilot. Around him, the soft thrum of men's nervous murmurs and the occasional clink of a helmet echoed through the fuselage. Outside, the wind gusted, tugging at the glider's tow rope like a living thing, as if Normandy itself were already reaching out to drag them in. The soldiers knew the drill, but only in theory. In practice, flying into darkness tethered to a fragile, unarmored glider was a gamble with death. The CG-4, barely more than a wooden skeleton with canvas sides, had no engine of its own. Its life, and theirs, depended entirely on the pilot's skill and sheer nerve. Once released, they would hurtle across flooded fields at 90 miles per hour, aiming for landing zones mapped out by aerial reconnaissance, but mapped from the air, not tested by boots on the ground. Kerr adjusted his helmet, catching the gleam of a young paratrooper's eyes beside him. Private James Donnelly, barely 20, grinned with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "We're actually doing this," he whispered. Inside France, the words barely left his mouth before a shout cut through the cabin. "Hook up! Take your positions." The tow plane's engines roared to life, drowning the murmurs in a mechanical crescendo. And then, as the convoy of gliders and C-47s began taxiing down the airstrip, the realization struck every man in that line. Once they cut loose over Normandy, there would be no turning back. The fields of France awaited, flooded, fortified, and bristling with the Wehrmacht's defenses. The Atlantic Wall had loomed as an insurmountable barrier for months, but tonight, the Allies would attempt to pierce it from the inside, carried not by the roar of tanks or bombardments, but by the fragile wings of gliders and the courage of men who refused to wait for morning. The first glider detached, its ropes snapping with a sharp crack, swinging like a pendulum in the inky night. Soldiers felt the jolt through the canvas walls, a violent reminder that gravity and luck were now in charge. Murphy's plane shuddered, maintaining altitude and speed, as more gliders peeled off into the darkness. In those first few seconds, the cold wind was filled with the whine of metal straining against wood, the muffled cries of men gripping their seats, and the rhythmic thud of boots bracing for impact. Kerr's heart pounded as he glimpsed the terrain below. Floodwaters glinting like liquid mirrors, hedgerows slicing the fields into patchwork grids, and faintly, the dim glimmer of gun flashes along the coast. In the blackness, each shadow could conceal a machine gun, each ripple in the water a deadly trap. Yet the men leaned forward in anticipation, not fear. They were the spearhead, the unseen hammer striking at the heart of Fortress Europe. As the gliders vanished into the night, Murphy radioed back to the command tower one final time. "Al's quiet on our end. Let's bring the wall down." In that instant, the air seemed to hold its breath. The men in the gliders had only the night, their training, and the faint glow of landing lights ahead to guide them. Every heartbeat, every whispered prayer was a countdown to the unknown. Normandy waited, and history would remember who dared to fly straight into the jaws of Europe's deadliest fortifications. The gliders tore through the darkness, wooden wings quivering under the strain, each one carrying its precious cargo of men, weapons, and jeeps. Below, the flooded fields of Normandy stretched like a liquid maze, hedgerows rising like walls, and small farms dotting the land in eerie, moonlit isolation. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of wind a warning. For the soldiers inside, the silence of night was broken only by the roar of the tow plane above and the tense, rapid fire orders whispered between glider pilots and infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy felt the tug of the glider rope tighten and then release. The first Waco glider lurched forward, dropping like a stone into the fields. Inside, Colonel Mike Kerr braced himself as the fuselage shuddered, the landing gear digging into mud and water. The impact was violent, throwing men into seats, slamming rifles and packs across the cabin. Screams, yells, and the unmistakable crunch of timber against earth filled the night. Somehow, by sheer skill, or perhaps by luck, the glider skidded to a stop without breaking apart entirely. Outside, the soldiers spilled into the cold, flooded fields. Water squelched beneath their boots, pulling at their ankles as they formed ranks in the dark. Jeeps, dislodged from the gliders, tipped dangerously in the mud before being righted, while howitzers clanged against the wet earth as men struggled to position them. The cacophony of the landing was punctuated by distant artillery, the faint pop of German small arms, and the unmistakable hum of other gliders still cutting through the night sky. Private Donnelly clutched his rifle and peered across the flooded expanse. Where do we go?" he whispered, voice trembling with both fear and adrenaline. Colonel Kerr's eyes swept the horizon, taking in the hedgerows, the waterlogged fields, and the faint glimmer of lights near the coast. "Forward," he barked. "Every second we hesitate gives them time to regroup. Move." The Americans had landed behind Utah Beach, in a place the Wehrmacht had considered secure. But the glider assault had already shattered that illusion. Soldiers darted between waist-high floodwaters, using the cover of darkness to advance toward key positions, while German sentries scrambled, caught off guard by men seemingly appearing from nowhere. The sound of gunfire began to punctuate the night, not in endless barrages but in precise, terrifying bursts as paratroopers and glider infantry engaged in the deadly chess match of sudden warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy guided his plane to circle back, scanning for more gliders and the faint glimmer of landing zones. Each pilot faced the same peril, a tight landing in mud-choked fields, dodging obstacles and avoiding enemy fire. Yet one by one, the gliders touched down, bringing jeeps, weapons, and screaming troopers into the heart of Normandy. By dawn, over 4,000 American soldiers had landed behind the German lines, some unscathed, some battered and wet, but all alive. The Atlantic Wall, the monumental fortress meant to repel any invasion, had already been penetrated from within. Colonel Kerr moved among his men, checking positions and directing reinforcements. He barked orders to set up defensive lines, coordinate artillery, and secure key crossroads. The Germans, still groggy from the night's sudden chaos, could only respond in confusion. This wasn't a beachhead. They hadn't expected an army to arrive in their own backyards under cover of night, without artillery barrages or preliminary bombardment. The surprise was absolute, the shock complete. Meanwhile, the men began improvising. Sandbags were dragged through mud to form makeshift cover. Jeeps were pushed into strategic positions, and howitzers were aimed at roads and enemy positions further inland. The glider infantry moved with a precision born of training and desperation. Every man knew that each second counted, that each moment spent floundering in the flooded fields could be his last. Yet amidst the chaos, There was determination, an unspoken understanding that they had already changed the game. Normandy would never be the same again. By the time the first hints of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the flooded fields in muted gray, the full scale of the glider operation was visible. American paratroopers and glider infantry had carved out positions behind Utah Beach, jeeps and artillery pieces ready, men soaked but resolute, eyes scanning for the first signs of organized German counterattacks. The Atlantic Wall had a crack, and through it the Allies had poured. The night had been perilous, violent, and uncertain, but the Americans had arrived in force inside Fortress Europe itself. The first gray fingers of dawn revealed the true scope of the operation. Mud, choked fields, hedgerows riddled with bullet holes, and scattered gliders painted a scene of utter chaos. Colonel Mike Kerr moved through the ranks, shouting orders above the din of dripping water and the occasional crack of distant rifles. Each step sank deep into the flooded terrain, but the men followed him with a mix of fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline-fueled purpose. Every movement mattered. Every delay could give the Wehrmacht time to regroup. Private James Donnelly huddled behind a half-submerged jeep, rifle clutched tightly. Around him, soldiers struggled to lift artillery pieces free of mud, their uniforms plastered to their bodies, boots heavy with sludge. He could hear the faint, unmistakable thrum of approaching German vehicles. The enemy was waking, and they were furious. "Keep low," Sergeant Harris whispered, pressing his hand against Donnelly's shoulder. "They'll try to pick us off before we get set." The German response came swiftly. Machine gun fire cracked across the fields, striking mud and water, but occasionally hitting men and equipment. A nearby howitzer backfired, unprepared for the angle, but Kerr barked corrections, adjusting positions and directing return fire. Despite the chaos, the Americans had an advantage of surprise. The Germans were disoriented, unsure of where the main thrust had come from, while glider infantry moved like shadows, using flooded ditches and hedgerows for cover. Murphy circled back once more in his C-47, watching the unfolding battlefield from above. Smoke rose from overturned gliders, glinting gun barrels flashed in the morning light, and troops maneuvered with grim determination. He knew the danger his men had faced. The violent landings, the sudden engagement, the treacherous terrain, but also the courage they displayed. The 325th Glider Infantry Regiment was executing a mission that many thought impossible, and against all odds they were holding ground. Kerr spotted a cluster of German soldiers attempting to flank their position along a shallow ditch. With no hesitation, he signaled a squad to intercept. Men dashed through waterlogged fields, rifles raised, bullets cutting arcs through the dawn-lit mist. Private Donnelly found himself face to face with an enemy soldier, both freezing for a fraction of a second, eyes locked, before instinct took over. The firefight was over in moments, but it marked a critical realization for the Americans: this was no exercise. Normandy was alive with danger, and the men who had flown into the night were now fighting for every inch of ground. Amid the frenzy, glider pilots and crews were still working frantically. Jeeps were repositioned, radios scrambled into service, and howitzers aimed at roads where German reinforcements might arrive. Every action required improvisation. One trooper, Corporal Jensen, waded into the flooded ditch to retrieve ammunition floating away, drenched and exhausted, but he returned triumphant, delivering the supplies just in time for the next volley. Acts like this multiplied across the battlefield, stitching together a fragile but resilient network of defenses. As the sun rose higher, the first reinforcements from the beach began to filter in, joining the glider troops already entrenched behind enemy lines. Kerr coordinated with beach commanders via crackling radios, directing men and equipment to hold and expand the newly captured positions. What had begun as a daring, almost reckless insertion behind the Atlantic Wall was now a coordinated push, an inside-out invasion that the Wehrmacht had never anticipated. Despite the exhaustion, the men pressed forward. Flooded fields became corridors of movement, hedgerows offered precarious cover, and every successful engagement strengthened the foothold behind Utah Beach. Murphy, circling above in his aircraft, could see the Americans' progress etched into the landscape, small but significant patches of controlled ground. Scattered gliders now serving as defensive positions, and troops pressing toward the coast to link with the main landing force. By mid-morning, the initial chaos began to settle into the rhythm of combat. The glider troops had landed, fought, improvised, and survived. They had transformed flooded fields into strongpoints, overturned gliders into barricades, and uncertainty into action. The Atlantic Wall, once thought impenetrable, had a permanent wedge forced behind it, and the men who had flown into the night now stood, bloodied but unbowed, as the spearhead of a monumental assault on Fortress Europe. By late morning, the sound of naval bombardment rolling in from offshore joined the steady rhythm of small arms fire inland. The men of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment had established a tenuous foothold, but now came the next critical challenge: connecting their positions behind enemy lines with the forces storming Utah Beach. Communication lines were sparse and fragile. Muddy fields had swallowed radios, and messengers sprinted through waterlogged terrain, dodging sniper fire, to deliver messages that could mean life or death. Colonel Kerr moved along the improvised defenses, shouting instructions over the roar of artillery and the hiss of bullets. Jeeps were deployed to ferry men and ammunition to forward positions, their engines churning mud as troopers clung to the sides. The gliders, some smashed and splintered, were now part of the battlefield itself, walls of wood and canvas providing cover from machine, gun nests, and sniper fire. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy, having landed in a secondary glider earlier in the morning, joined Kerr on the ground. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with mud and sweat, but his eyes were sharp as he scanned the horizon. The Germans were not idle. Counterattacks began to form, small units attempting to push the Americans back into the flooded fields. Mortar shells arced overhead, exploding in geysers of mud and water. Troopers ducked behind jeeps, hedgerows, and even overturned gliders, firing back with rifles, submachine guns, and the newly positioned howitzers. Despite the chaos, discipline and training shone through. Men who had flown into enemy territory hours before were now coordinating suppressive fire, flanking maneuvers, and artillery strikes with terrifying precision. Private Donnelly and Sergeant Harris scrambled toward a hedgerow, dragging a wounded comrade behind them. Blood mingled with the mud as bullets ricocheted from nearby trees. "We can't hold much longer if they push this hard," Harris shouted, scanning the advancing German troops. Donnelly nodded grimly, adjusting his rifle. The fear lingered, but it was tempered by the sense of purpose. The knowledge that every second they held the line allowed the beach landings to gain traction. By mid-afternoon, supply lines from the beach finally began to stabilize. Trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements chugged through makeshift roads cut through the flooded fields. Colonel Kerr coordinated with beach commanders to funnel the new arrivals into positions where they could strengthen the glider troops' hold. Murphy, now airborne again, observed as waves of reinforcements linked the isolated glider units with the main invasion force. The glider soldiers had not only survived, they had become the nucleus of a broader operational network stretching inland from Utah Beach. Amidst the brutal fighting, moments of quiet heroism punctuated the battle. Corporal Jensen, who had risked his life earlier to retrieve floating ammunition, now led a squad to capture a German machine gun nest that had pinned down their line. With precise fire and coordinated movements, they neutralized the threat, allowing the Americans to advance further. Across the fields, countless similar acts unfolded. men improvising, adapting, and pushing back against an enemy who had underestimated the sheer audacity of airborne glider operations. By evening, the initial phase of the glider assault had achieved its goal. Over 4,000 men, along with jeeps, artillery, and equipment, were firmly positioned behind enemy lines. The Atlantic Wall, the massive fortification that had once seemed impenetrable, now bore a permanent scar, a breach that the Allies would exploit to expand their beachhead and press inland. Colonel Kerr surveyed the battlefield, exhaustion heavy on his shoulders but pride evident in his eyes. The men around him, soaked, mud-caked, and battered, shared a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had arrived, fought, and survived where so many had thought survival impossible. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the flooded fields. Normandy, still thick with the chaos of battle, bore witness to a daring operation that would be remembered for generations. The men of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, carried by fragile wooden gliders into the heart of enemy territory, had done what few thought possible. They had turned the Atlantic Wall from an insurmountable barrier into a battlefield of opportunity, opening the way for the liberation of Europe. Nightfall descended on the battered fields of Normandy, and with it came a rare moment of quiet for the men who had flown into history. Colonel Mike Kerr walked among his troops, inspecting positions, offering terse words of praise, and checking on the wounded. Jeeps sat in mud-caked rows, howitzers had been repositioned, and makeshift barricades, often nothing more than overturned gliders and sandbags, lined the edges of the newly won territory. The soldiers, though exhausted, moved with a disciplined energy, reinforcing defenses, distributing ammunition, and tending to comrades where they could. Private James Donnelly sat by a half-submerged hedgerow, rifle resting across his lap. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with mud and sweat, and yet his eyes shone with a mixture of relief and disbelief. We actually made it," he whispered to Sergeant Harris. Harris offered a tired, grim smile, nodding toward the distant sound of artillery and the occasional flare illuminating the fields. "We made it," he agreed, "and we changed the game tonight." Lieutenant Colonel Mike Murphy, finally on solid ground after multiple flights guiding gliders into the battlefield, surveyed the area from a small rise. From this vantage point, the scale of what had just occurred was staggering. Over 4,000 soldiers had landed behind enemy lines in darkness, in flooded fields, and under constant threat. They had carried jeeps, artillery, and supplies, fought off counterattacks, and held ground against a prepared enemy. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's great defensive line, had been cracked not by sheer bombardment, but by audacity, skill, and courage. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Colonel Kerr gathered his officers. Maps were spread across a mud-caked jeep hood. Radios crackled with updates from Utah Beach, and a tense but resolute discussion unfolded. Reinforcements were still making their way inland, but the glider troops had done more than survive. They had created the crucial bridge between the beach landings and the interior, enabling the broader Allied push into France. Every decision made, every risk taken in the past 24 hours had ripple effects that would shape the success of D-Day and the liberation of Europe. Among the men, stories began to circulate of narrow escapes, daring maneuvers, and quiet heroism. Corporal Jensen's seizure of the machine gun nest became legend in its own right. Private Donnelly's trek through flooded fields with wounded comrades was recounted in whispered admiration. Each act, seemingly small in the chaos of battle, had contributed to a larger, unprecedented achievement, landing an entire regiment with vehicles and artillery behind the strongest defenses in Europe and holding them. Yet beneath the triumph lay the sobering cost. Wounded men cried softly in the mud. Some had been torn from the gliders during violent landings, others had faced direct enemy fire as soon as they touched the earth. Colonel Kerr, aware of every loss and near miss, felt the weight of command. The victory was immense, but it was built on sacrifice, courage, and the willingness of ordinary men to confront extraordinary danger. As midnight approached, the fields of Normandy fell silent, save for the distant rumble of naval artillery and the occasional sharp crack of a sentry's rifle. The men rested where they could, soaking in the rare quiet, reflecting on the night that had changed the course of history. The gliders, once fragile vessels of hope and terror, now stood as symbols of audacity, the thin wooden skeletons that had delivered the hammer blow behind enemy lines. In the years that would follow, historians would marvel at the operation's brilliance. Colonels, lieutenants, and privates alike would be celebrated for their courage. But on this night, in the mud and darkness of Normandy, it was simple survival, steadfastness, and resolve that mattered most. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, Fortress Europe had been pierced, and the men of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment had proven that even the most improbable strategies could succeed when met with skill, daring, and unbreakable will. The glider pilots and infantry had flown into the unknown, and now, as dawn approached over the horizon, they had not only arrived, they had transformed the course of war. Normandy would never forget the night the Americans came from the skies, riding fragile wooden wings straight into the heart of enemy territory, and survived to tell the tale.